Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming. I really appreciate your presence here. My name is Crain, and I am a business student at Grand Valley State University. My career passions involve basically the scientific understanding of business operations. Sounds dry, but my bread and butter is really measurement, modeling, and then application and replication in business operations. And the connection to servant leadership to my career interest, it actually comes through my skills as a percussionist. So last year I was on the drum line at Grand Valley, and I had the opportunity of experiencing what servant leadership absolutely does not look like. And yeah, it was a difficult experience at times. And some people, you have to get to know them to really know what they think and what they believe in their worldview. But some people, it's just written all over them. And the instructors and the leadership, student leadership on the drum line, it was just written straight up, I only care about myself. And by the way, I have a lot of problems on the inside, and I'm at war, and I'm just going to turn it out all on you. So that was a really meaningful experience. That's what really inspired me to write a paper on this and prepare this presentation. So I'd appreciate it if you all, a little bit of audience participation, get you moving. It's not that bad. I'd like you to set your expectations really low. So that way we'll all leave satisfied with the presentation, right? So I want to talk about, first I want to talk about worldview and what that really means. And then I want to go into basically Christian worldview as it relates to servant leadership. And the three essential traits of servant leadership as they relate to Christian worldview is humility, wisdom, and integrity. And I'm going to spend most of the time on humility because that's really where the servant part of leadership comes from. So worldview has two elements, logical element and an emotional element, a visual element. The logical element is your ologies, your theology, biology, psychology, sociology, and then including philosophy, history, law, that sort of thing. And that's really why you believe what you believe, how it applies, does it make sense, is it sensible? And then the emotional, the visual aspect is really why you want to believe what you believe, how you communicate it to other people, why you're passionate about it. And you really need a balance of both to be effective in communicating your worldview and making sure that you actually have a legitimate worldview. And since this discussion, and it looks like we went more into biblical history in the last session, but this session really isn't about Christian theology, so I'm going to be taking minutiae aspects, so I'm not really going to be explaining Christianity very well. So if you want to see the greatest balance of worldview, that logical element and the visual element, C.S. Lewis wrote a book called Mere Christianity, lays it out. It really makes you think, but you also really understand it, get the really emotional aspect. And you might actually know more from the Chronicles of Narnia. He also wrote those. So let's dive into servant leadership. So humility. John Dixon wrote a book called Humilitas, basically looking at the Greek root of the word humility and how it relates to leadership. And I'm going to paraphrase his definition of leadership. And first of all, it's not modesty. It's really about the abandonment of self in the service of others. So it's really interesting to look back. Today, we prize humility in society. It was definitely not always that way. 2,000 years ago, society was existed as an honor-shame orientation. So pride was actually prized above humility. Humility was actually humiliation, which is the same root of humilitas. And so it was perfectly acceptable, if not encouraged, that if you had status over someone else, that you made it known, that you talked about yourself more often, that sort of thing. And so John Dixon, who wrote this book, he was part of a secular study of a university in Australia that really looked to see why society shifted from honor-shame to what it is today. And this study identified this actual passage in the Bible as the literal reason for the shift in society. So from the book of Philippians, chapter 2, verses 3 through 9. And so this is, for those not familiar with the Bible, this is at the end of the Bible. So, do nothing out of selfish ambition or in vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interest, but each of you to the interest of others. In your relationship with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus, who, this is a really important part, being in the very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness. And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. And that's a really important part that we're going to cover again. Therefore, God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name that is above every name. So, the Bible is a really interesting historical document. It's 60-odd books, written by 40-odd authors over 1,000 years. And what's really remarkable is it tells the same story the entire time. And one of the themes that has a lot of theological importance that we're not going to cover, but one of the themes is that God, who is the all-powerful creator of the universe, he made, everything from the macro level, like the sun and the stars, and to the micro level of everything, the complex processes that allow me to be talking to you today. He made all that. He's omniscient, omnipotent, all that sort of stuff. But he instead chooses to display his power by using the least among us, the most unexpected, underqualified people possible. And that happens all throughout the Bible. And the case in point that this verse talked about is Jesus himself. Jesus, being God, was born into poverty, and his social situation was so poor that his people group, the Nazarenes, don't get mentioned in historical texts outside the Bible. Born into nothing, and seemingly the most unexpected person who would save humanity, basically, quite literally, actually. So, that becoming obedient to death, even on a cross. In that honor-shame society, death by crucifixion was the most humiliating way to die. I personally think any way to die is pretty bad, but to them, there was just something about crucifixion that made it the most humiliating way, and that was the Roman Empire's tool of fear. So as that applies to servant leadership, again, that definition of servant leadership, that abandonment of self in the service of others. God himself essentially abandoned his position in order to save humanity. So as a Christian, it's essential to be humble in servant leadership. It's so important to not be focused on self, but really serving others. And we're going to reemphasize that with another verse later on. And so, an application, one thing that you could walk away today being able to apply in your life is the idea of being available. There are plenty of ways to apply humility and really focus on the abandonment of self, but being available, mostly young people here, but there are a few elders as well. And for both, all ages, being available to people who come in contact with you, removing your position or whatever status you have over someone and making yourself available to them to help them out. That's a practice that's made a significant impact on my life as everyone from executives to directors to older people have just made themselves available to me who I don't really warrant anything. I'm just a student, right? And so that's really helped me out, that mentorship. So the next trait is wisdom. And in my business classes, wisdom is typically defined as the joining of knowledge to apply it on something. And I think that's a really cheapified definition. That really doesn't have the weight that is really associated with it. So naturally, I prefer the Bible's definition, as found in Proverbs. And most of Proverbs were written by Solomon, king of Israel, easily the most wise man ever lived, and historically, very possibly the richest man who ever lived, more so than even Bill Gates or Carnegie or any of them. So Proverbs chapter 1, verses 1 through 7. The Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel, for gaining wisdom and instruction, for understanding words of insight, for receiving instruction in prudent behavior, doing what is right and just and fair, for giving prudence to those who are simple, knowledge and discretion to the young. Let the wise listen and add to their learning, and let the discerning get guidance. For understanding proverbs and parables, the saying and riddles of the wise. Emphasis here. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. So, like I mentioned, we want to spend most of the time on the humility, so we're not going to spend too much time on wisdom and integrity, so it'll be a little bit short. But there's two points I want to emphasize there. One, that distinction between wise people and the fools. Dr. Henry Cloud, a clinical psychologist who does leadership coaching, he wrote a book called Necessary Endings, where he really developed that idea of the wise person and the fool. And so he separated all people into three categories: the wise, the fool, and then those bent on destruction. And that last category sounds really interesting, but we're not really going to talk about that right now. So most people fit into those previous two categories. So the wise person, if something goes wrong or whatever, they can receive correction and change. They can apply it. They can learn from it. But the fool will resist change, and he applies it in a business setting. A fool will shift blame or try to avoid consequences or whatever it is. So Dr. Cloud was making the point that if you're in business and either you are a fool or you work with fools, that your business is hurting. And so is your team. Whereas the wise people are the ones that can adapt to the changing times and really apply it. So in servant leadership, you have to be learning. You have to be growing in wisdom. So that's the second point. How do you do that? And for a Christian, that's growing in fear or reverence of God. And the best way to do that is by continually reading the Bible. And not so much that, but gaining wisdom in all areas, reading as much as you can. And I know in my own life, if I start the day with reading a chapter from the Bible and a few pages out of a book on leadership, for example, like right now I'm reading Courageous Leadership by Bill Hybels, it puts you in a mindset, it prepares you for the day that I'm going to act as a servant leader. You've learned something early in the morning, and now you can apply it and make a difference in that way. So the third trait is integrity. And there's a lot of theological association around integrity that I'm going to skip as well. But what I really want to focus on is the Latin root, at least according to my 11th grade English teacher. Teg, integrity, right? And teg. Teg means whole. So integrity is about your whole being. So it's about actually being humble, actually being wise, or really truly growing in wisdom. And Stephen R. Covey, who wrote 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, he noticed in the last 50 years, more like 70 now since he wrote it, that leadership has, instead of being a character trait, has become a behavior. So I know that if I'm humble, this person is going to trust me more. I know if I don't lie to this person, again, the trust is there. Or if I pay attention to this person, they'll be more interested, more passionate about doing whatever it is that they're supposed to be doing. That's not integrity. Integrity is actually about holding those values in your character. And so how do you get to that point? Well, that goes back to wisdom. You have to be growing in wisdom. And how do you grow in wisdom? You grow in fear and reverence to the Lord. How do you do that? Reading the Bible, reading books, right? So those are the 3 essential characteristics. And I want to sum it up with another verse I think that hits even more home. This is Mark 10:43-45, the actual words of Jesus. Whoever desires to be great among you shall be your servant, and whoever desires to be first shall be slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many. So it's not just even servant leadership or abandonment of self in service of others, but at times it's becoming the slave to others. It's that extent, that importance of abandonment of self, of giving up whatever desires that you have in service of others, in slavehood almost to others. So that's the combination of servant leadership and the Christian worldview. So at this time, open up for Q&A.
So service leadership, obviously it's a passion of yours. What groups on campus are you involved in? Were you able to apply it, and have you seen a effective transfer of that to other leaders in the group?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I go to school in Grand Rapids, and if you're familiar with Grand Rapids, it has this amazing culture. There's a lot of wealth, but the culture has actually a fairly strong Christian faith background, and the people who have this amazing amount of money are so focused on giving back in philanthropy. So I have the fortune of being a Van Andel Leadership Fellow in the Cook Leadership Academy. And that's basically a mentorship program where we get to be connected to those people or the key leaders in Grand Rapids. And it's just this, like an incubator for servant leadership and an ethical grounding and that integrity. Really believing that this is the right way to go. So that's one of the organizations I think has made a significant impact on my life, and that's really where I see it being applied, including in secular settings.
Did you write this paper for a class or anything, or was this just?
I did, yes. I wrote it a year and a half ago for my first honors class.
Okay.
Live, Learn, Lead. So it was an open-ended project, and we could do whatever we wanted. And I was currently in the drumline at the time, and I was like, this is awful, so I need to write about it. And so I wrote 29 pages about it. So.
Kind of a comment that I'd like to make. I know that you come from the biblical aspect, and so you did use the quotes. But instead of coming from fear and reverence, have you tried coming from love and reverence for your God as well as the humanity for which you serve? So maybe try changing from the fear-based aspect to the state of unconditional love, and it might offer a greater effect for you.
That's a good point.
I know it's in the Bible that
yeah,
way, so, but I just, a suggestion.
Yeah, there's a huge element about unconditional love in the Bible, that grace and mercy aspect. Fear isn't necessarily being terrified. So there's an element of fear because, again, this is God who created everything. He's more powerful than anything in the universe because he created the universe, right? So there's an element of fear in that, but that's reverence. So it's more of a loving reverence than it is a I'm terrified to be alive and I must do this because I feel guilty. That's what you're getting at.
Because I believe we need to work beyond our fears to
Mhm.
come to a state of love. So
Mhm.
that's
Yeah.
one.
So that there is a theological distinction there, but yes.
Just curious if we can take a little extension of this for a moment and think about, because we take a step back. I think servant leadership is an admirable goal, not just for a Christian, right? I think that's what you would agree with me, that this should be something, that this is an effective form of leadership for in a secular arena as well as someone who's trying to be an effective Christian. So maybe if you could speak for a moment about how much you communicate that without necessarily drawing on Christian theology. I mean, is there, maybe we're going too far, and this is something that I'm just brainstorming for a second, but maybe if you can speak to that for just a couple of seconds. How much you speak to someone and communicate about servant leadership without communicating to them about, Christian theology?
Right. Yeah, and that's a tough question, but there is that element. First of all, abandon yourself. That's not, you don't have to be a Christian to care more about other people, right? But one thing that I really didn't focus on in this paper is the statistical importance of servant leadership in business. And you have a lot of leaders today, secular leaders, who are writing books and doing case studies and whatnot in servant leadership. And it's today you see a shift in business. For example, 50 years ago, it was the cubicle, and you just kind of did your work and you were expected to do your work. But now it's changing more in a servant leadership to a more servant leadership way, where companies are concerned about their employees, right? So communicating the value of servant leadership, I think I would definitely use the secular literature, but it's not just, it's an important concept for I don't want to say this because it kind of goes counter to my point, but you kind of appeal to the selfish nature of people. They want to be treated well, right? So you want your company to give you benefits and make sure that you're not overworked and you have a great work-life balance. But that goes so countercultural to the band in itself. But yeah, it is a really valuable practice because I think people notice how much of an impact it makes their own lives.
You're saying it's going against what you're saying. I would disagree with that. That what you do is you would get in with them and saying, like appealing to their selfish nature, but saying in order to get this goal, you have to abandon yourself. So that it's that turn around anyway.
Yeah,
and I apologize for making. I'm just trying to see if we can.
No, great question. Thank you.
I'm just curious, what types of secular business do you see servant leadership coming more to the forefront? Just curious. Or is it just businesses in general?
I think I forgot to mention where I work. I work at Steelcase, a logistics continuous improvement there, intern, excuse me. And I think just working in that environment, that is one place. Again, it's in Grand Rapids, so it's based in Grand Rapids. So you have that influence of the Pews. Actually, Pews are one of the major philanthropists, and they're one of the founding families of Steelcase. And so even there, I notice it's not about coming to work and being rigid. They do a lot with. I work with a woman who she was allowed to work part-time while her kids were young. That kind of idea. Being able to do that, work from home or work only a certain number of days, but still allowing her to continue and have her life, but also have her work and contribute that way. And she's one of the top contributors in our group. Without her, we'd be very much lost because she knows a lot. So it's that recognition that she's valuable and allowing her to do that. So that's one place that I've seen it. And there's a lot of companies like when Google, smaller, a lot of these tech companies, they do a lot of that kind of stuff where they're really about the people. And it's also a family-oriented culture. For example, Dow Corning is a family-oriented culture. It's a big $6 billion private company, but they're about working as a team. So there's lots of examples all around. So hopefully I answered your question.
How do you go into secular environments like this one and use that servant leadership attitude and minister as well? How do you bring that in if you do at all?
I sure hope I do. I think it's a lot. I think I start with respect. Not everybody gives each other respect today, and there's a lot of, just if you've ever worked in a professional environment, you have very clearly different personalities. Some people are, everyone knows who the whiner is. Everyone knows, who's negative. Everyone knows who's the top boss. That sort of thing. So I want to be known as a guy who's respectful to everybody. And so I think that's where, in terms of ministering, being specifically, I'm assuming you're going for the evangelizing or proselytizing aspect.
How do you slip that in there?
Yeah, you slip that in there by first living it and people noticing. So that's when you can start having the conversations after they're like, why are you so respectful when no one else is giving you respect? So.
A comment I'd have, and it really, as I was listening, I enjoyed it very much.
Thank you.
But that the switch you noted that in the last 50, 60, 70 years, we've stopped thinking about leadership as something we are and change it into something we do, where you can, you can take a class and read the manual and you see the checklist of this is what you have to do to be a leader. And I'd never thought of that. It's a very big shift because it kind of lets us off the hook. I can still be a jerk in life as long as when I walk in the office door, I'm following the checklist, I get to be a leader, and it does kind of relieve us of that personal transformation that the Christian worldview certainly thinks is an essential part. And that was very provocative. I like that. And I'd also mention, John 13 with the foot washing, where Jesus washes the feet of the disciples and said, if you want to be my follower, you have to do for one another as I've done for you, taking the lowest place and setting that as a model for what it means to be a follower. So
right? And
But you can only fit so many verses in, so I'm not.
yeah, exactly.
I liked all the verses you
No, I
quoted,
considered
so.
that because I'm not Catholic, but I was very impressed with what the Pope did recently on Good Friday. He modeled Jesus in the way that instead of going to, I'm assuming it was a mass on Good Friday, and doing the, it's probably a gorgeous building, a gorgeous ritual service. Instead of doing that, he went instead to a juvenile detention facility and washed and kissed the feet of kids who have ruined their lives already. And that I think meant a lot to me, and that was really modeling what Jesus was talking about.
I think that's a really, I was struck by that. I thought that was, it really communicated something about who he was, not
Mhm.
just
Right.
what the Pope ought to do
Right,
as a
yeah.
Catholic, but it was a very powerful way of communicating his person and his attitude. That is just what you're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely.
Are there other questions?
So, as Christians, we're first and foremost followers. So how do you differentiate when to make the switch between being a leader and a follower?
That's a great question, and I was wondering if something like that was going to come up. If you notice, let me pull out the actual card. Whoever desires to be great among you shall be your servant. So Christianity is not about perpetual modesty, in the sense of like you just can't be a leader, you can't be an executive, you can't. But that leadership is there. Jesus was still God, and he still expected worship. So whoever desires to be great among you shall first be your servant. So it's that idea of serving people, but practicing the skills of a leader. And actually, so if you are in a position where you're a manager or a director of the honors college or something like that, you still have to be a leader, and you still have to orient people toward a goal, a vision. But you do that in a way that is serving them, that helps them out.
Well, thank you. I think so we'll stay on track here. We're just right where we need to be. We're not running
Okay.
behind.
Absolutely.
But I want to give a round of applause.
Thank you.